everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about the unintended consequences of design. My name is Blenkin. I'm a designer working in technology, and I love sketching as well, which is why I was really excited to join this conference here today. I'm from Canada, although I'm living in London in the UK right now. I'm the Associate Director of a program called Pivotal Act, which is a program where we're working with nonprofits to help them build custom software as well as building up their digital capacities in order to maintain technology in the long run. But I didn't always start in tech. I actually started out in fine art, but decided that I enjoyed making physical objects more. So I switched into industrial design, where I was designing cars and furniture. But I didn't want to encourage mass production, although I loved 3D modeling. So I switched into service design, where we're thinking about the whole end-to-end process and all the different interactions that people may engage with during a service. And this is an image from a program, an educational program that I designed with my colleagues, where we got kids to think about sustainable energy futures, and we won a National Science Award and grant that was able to implement it into a few schools in Germany. And this is really where it came together for me as a designer. So I decided to continue my education and do a master's in transdisciplinary design at Parsons in New York. And I know that's quite a mouthful, but essentially it's different disciplines coming together to address systemic problems. So we had people from urban planning background, policy, astrophysicists, architects, industrial designers, all coming together to look and address different broken problems. And since then, I've actually made my way into technology and product design. And what I realized in switching into technology was that because something has been designed, it's often associated with it being better. The output itself is a better solution. But sometimes design can create more problems, and you can actually do more harm than good, because we may not understand the implications of our work, or there might be assumptions and biases that go into the decisions that we make that may have negative implications. So today I want to talk about the cost of bad design, how to think in systems and more holistically, and how to speculate potential impacts and think about mitigating risk. So what is the cost of bad design? Here I'm not talking about unusable products or dark patterns. Here I'm talking about design choices that have led to systemic or societal impacts. A good example of this is the Olympic Games in Rio. And the Olympic Games cost about $13 billion and promised all sorts of benefits for Brazil and its residents. But it had massive societal impacts. Keep in mind, the government could barely afford wages for doctors and teachers, and families were pushed out of their homes to make way for these Olympic facilities. And few hosting cities have been able to maintain the cost of keeping them going. For example, in Athens, they couldn't pay the electricity just 6 months after the games. So let's just map it out. How are the Olympics designed? So the Olympics are designed and constructed by committees, companies, governments, etc. And they promise additional tourism and revenue, but this isn't sustainable growth. And the lack of systemic planning, as we've seen in Rio and Greece, leads to all sorts of negative impacts, from the depletion of natural resources, environmental destruction. It's built on cheap labor. There's massive inequalities in Rio from the Olympic Committee executives and the people that are working in the Olympic Village. The inequality and violation of human rights. And in Greece, the Olympics contributed to a decade-long depression. All of this has resulted in a decline in tourism, which is exactly the opposite of what the Olympics prides itself on. Many hosting cities have tried to repurpose the venues to host other sporting events, And we have seen some successful cases in London or Calgary, but few cities have that infrastructure and that longer term planning. And as a result, there are knock-on impacts. The action of hosting an event like the Olympics will translate into labor, monetary transactions, new regulations, policies, and a whole host of other decisions that will impact society and the natural ecosystem. And because I found myself in technology, I've become very sensitive to how these decisions are made and who makes them, who's responsible. The move fast and break things, or the hacker mentality born out of Silicon Valley, is only making things worse, and it's deeply problematic. The ideology that looks at technology as the solution to any given problem. We plan, code, and design wearing blinders. Erica Hall, co-founder of Mule and author of Just Enough Research, says that lean techniques are supposed to help reduce waste. But in practice, they're used as a cover for rushing to less thoughtful solutions without considering the longer-term implications. A good analogy for this, and to really take a step back and start understanding how we can design to consider some of those systemic impacts, is this painting called The Blind Men and the Elephant. And the moral of the parable is that humans tend to claim absolute truth based on their very limited and subjective experience. So everyone in this painting is seeing a more complex reality and tends to assume they see the whole picture. And I believe that this is happening because of the design methods and tools that we're using. We're only fixating on one part of the system rather than seeing the whole. So I want to move on to how we might start thinking in systems in order to tackle some of these more complex problems. So what does it mean to start thinking in systems? So our lives are completely codependent on the living systems around us, plants, animals, soil. Everything is interconnected. And when one system fails, it creates ripple effects throughout the entire ecosystem. And I think we're really seeing this now, where the cracks in our financial systems are on display. And there are all sorts of ripple effects to our healthcare, education systems. But this crisis can be the conditions for change. And that's why it's so important for us to understand whole systems. So what is a system? A system is a set of interconnected things. Things can be made up of actors, tasks, relationships, channels, structures, and systems can be anything from financial, weather, healthcare, education. And we can't really understand a system until we understand how these two things are tangled up with each other. Often we're just looking at the one specific user group that we're designing for within a financial system. We're not thinking about how all of those things are interrelated. Kind of example of this is when we are working with the Red Cross as part of the work with Pivotal Act around areas that are impacted by cyclones in the South Pacific. And this is in an area called Vanuatu. And we were really looking at what are all the different systems that are affected. And so originally we were thinking about shelter, but you can't really think about shelter in isolation. The problems shift depending on your perspective. And so shelter is connected to all sorts of other sub-problems like overcrowding, homelessness, migration, food insecurity. And we have to see that as a whole. A good model for really understanding how to think in systems is Donella Meadows' iceberg model. And if you haven't read any of her work, I would definitely recommend it. I think that she is kind of the systems queen. And she has put forward a lot of amazing work. And one of her models is this iceberg where you have the events, trends, and pattern structures, and mental models. And often, a lot of the products and services that we're designing are a response to something that has immediately happened. So it's very short-term solutions as a response to that specific event. There's also trends and patterns, so what has been happening. So the methods we use around human-centered design and lean are trying to take into account what are some of those patterns that we're seeing over time and designing for those. But then if you kind of dig deeper to the structures, why and how is this happening, try to explain some of those trends rather than just looking at it as a more surface level. What are those causal factors? And then what are the mental models, the beliefs, the cultural norms that lead people to behave in a certain way? What are the assumptions that people share? What are the social and economic injustices that reinforces certain behaviors? All of these things we have to understand in order to start to make systemic change. And I'm not saying that you have to map out all of these systems, because that task would be endless and impossible. But it's important to start looking at the problems from those various different levels rather than just focusing on the specific events that have been happening around you. So a few tools to start thinking in systems is to really map out the system collaboratively. An example I wanted to give was a project that I was working on in New York around access to education for undocumented people. And this is a project that we are collaborating on with an organization and charity called La Union. For documented people, access to education is generally quite straightforward. But for undocumented people, it's much more complex. And the problem is going to look different depending on your perspective. From an undocumented individual, an academic institution, policymaker, urban planners, community boards, all of these different actors are going to come to the problem with different motivations and incentives, and it's helpful to understand that and map out those different mental models. So here is a visual of really understanding what education looks like, informal and formal education, from the perspective of an undocumented young person, and all the different factors that they need to consider and ways they get access to education. And from what we found from that research was that there are all sorts of barriers that prevent people from getting access to education without documentation. Things like fear, distrust, language, identification, generational gaps. And if we are just looking at it at the surface level, it might just be fear of accessing certain things. But we need to dig deeper to some of the structural problems, some of the mental beliefs that make people react and act in a certain way. Another type of mapping that you can do is mapping out the relationships between those different actors. And by mapping out these relationships, we can really start to understand how might we leverage certain strong relationships, reinforce those, rather than recreating them or not acknowledging those already existing relationships, and start to identify some of the power structures between them. You can then start mapping out the service that you have imagined, the future state and current state, thinking about those journeys, those individual journeys that you had mapped out, and how they fit within the different relationships that are non-existent or existent. And then you can start to bring that information together to start getting a better picture of what that overall system looks like. And this really helps you identify the boundaries of the system. What are the rules, the regulations, and then start to think about what are those positive levers for change? How can you start to create a product that will anticipate some of those potential implications, some of those areas where the user might not be able to get further in the system because you haven't designed it in a way to do that. So not just thinking about the product, but how that sits within a larger ecosystem. So the benefits of thinking in systems is you can start to think beyond the short term, really thinking about the longer term implications, avoid duplicating efforts. By mapping all of these different actors out and maybe the different initiatives, you can start to uncover that there's already great services that exist. Let's either do something else or reinforce those already existing relationships. And the third is around alternative strategies for engaging old problems. Sometimes it's easy just to dismiss certain ideas because we say, oh, that doesn't work. But By mapping it out and engaging different stakeholders in this process, your teammates, you can start to get different perspectives on that problem, much further beyond our limited understanding of these issues. And this is where the real innovation can come from, where we can start to identify those positive levers for change. And the last topic that I wanted to go into was speculating impact. So, how might we anticipate the implications of design solutions? So, a common method used to speculate any sort of scenario is a method called speculative design, which is really to question the underlying intent and reflect and act on alternative positive and negative possibilities. And we do this type of work all the time. Anytime you pick up a pen, go to the whiteboard, or sketch out ideas, you're reimagining new futures. You're speculating different ideas. An example that I wanted to give you was around a project we are working on in delivering cash aid in emergency response. And so this is a project we are working on with a consortium of 15 NGOs that wanted to better collaborate when distributing cash aid, which is just a different form of aid. So more traditionally, you can think of maybe clothing or food, but this is getting people cash where they need it and when they need it. And so NGOs often explain kind of the repetition, the work in silos. And one of the NGOs we were working with described a story of quite a common problem. And they gave us the example of the earthquake in 2015 in Nepal. And they said the first response meeting had about 80 different people across humanitarian and private sectors all wanting to get involved and to help, but there wasn't an efficient way to collaborate, and it led to a lot of duplication of work. And they wanted a safe way to share and aggregate data in a way that made it easier to collaborate. So at first, the consortium of NGOs, or also called the Collaborative Cash Delivery Networks, they said we need a dashboard to visualize all of this information. And if there's anyone in the room that has been asked to design a dashboard, I think you'd probably kind of just look down and think, oh, not again. The amount of times I've been asked to design dashboards, but I really don't think that they're solving a lot of problems, and they're often very hard to interpret. And so what we said is let's just step back and understand the problem a little bit deeper before we go in and jump into designing some sort of tool that allowed NGOs to share and aggregate data in one central place. So what we did was we started by mapping out the system, thinking about all the different NGOs that might collaborate. And the example we were using was a flash flood. And this is work we were testing and doing in Nairobi in Kenya. And so we were thinking about everything from that flash flood all the way to assessments, measuring and evaluating response, as well as giving people cash and registering them. And this process may look quite complicated and messy, and it's definitely not a pretty process. But what this allowed us to do was to think and anticipate and speculate potential ways where we could centralize information, share it, and visualize it. And so what I did was just made a simple paper house, and as we were understanding the tools that different NGOs use in order to collect that information around what people need, because you need to understand economic markets before you start distributing cash. And so we had these little houses to represent where data might be stored. And this meant that non-technical people could join in on the conversation and contribute and participate, which is really helpful when trying to understand mental models before building any sort of solution. Another thing that we used was just what if prompts. So this is quite simple. You can write it on a piece of paper and just put it onto your map and say, well, what if one NGO is using pen and paper to collect any sort of needs and assessments? How do they add to this system? Or what if another NGO is using historical data? How do you handle that? And this helped us imagine potential futures and ways that we might design for them, or maybe just completely change or pivot. And one of the examples that came up when mapping out this system and the specific problem around cash aid and how NGOs can collaborate was, what if data is accessed by the wrong people? For example, if terrorist organizations like Al-Shabaab in Somalia got access to lists of people that are receiving cash aid, their physical safety could be in danger. And so these speculative prompts helped us think through some of those negative implications. And all of this is to say that we need to start prioritizing slowing down. Design sprints are really great when you have a very, very, very specific problem that you're looking to address, but they are not going to solve complex and root causes of issues. And we need to bake this process in before we start jumping into developing any sort of product or platform, whatever it might be. How can we understand those root causes so that we don't just jump into building kind of band-aid solutions? So some tools to help speculate potential impacts is one tool called the future wheel. So to think about those ethical trade-offs. And the way it works is you put the solution or the problem in the center, and then you start to think about what are the first order and second order consequences as a result of that solution existing in the world. So an example that I can quickly give you is when we are working with an organization called Social Finance, which essentially tries to fill the gap where the government isn't able to provide certain services. And this was a project really focused on designing for young people transitioning out of social care. And the tool that we were designing for them was to help social workers better understand the needs that young people have and prepare them as they transition out of that government care. And so one of the solutions that we as a team had in mind was to generate this framework that would determine off a set of certain questions how well or how poorly the young person is doing, so that the social worker could have a better sense of how they could give them certain support or services. And as we kind of jumped in and started to think about what are the first order consequences of doing that, we started to realize that it's not that binary. You can't just say that they're doing well because they're in education, doing poorly because they don't have a job. There might be a whole host of other reasons as to why they're not in either or are in those things. They could have a baby, there could be mental health issues. And so what we decided to do after putting this framework in place and really thinking about some of those consequences was to put a hold on the framework and to collect enough information from the social workers and from the interviews before we proceeded with that. This was really a tool and evidence that we were able to bring to the board and the decision makers that were funding this project to say, this is why we've made certain decisions, which is quite a powerful tool when trying to advocate for this type of work. So really, we need to ask ourselves, what are the unintended consequences of releasing certain features, and how might we mitigate some of those risks? So some of the benefits of doing that is to identify those potential risks. You can use frameworks like the future wheel, what if prompts. There are a lot of different ways that you can speculate the potential impact. And then create a clear strategy to avoid those negative impacts. Build that into the roadmap so that you're not just forgetting about those things. And third, to avoid creating more problems. This really can help us anticipate some of those negative implications. So despite what sector you're in, I hope that this overview of using systems thinking and speculative scenarios has been helpful for you to broaden your approach when designing products and services. This is just an introduction. It's from my perspective. I would encourage you to do your research and check out other ways and tools of doing some of these techniques. But really, at the end of the day, we are all responsible for the technology and the design choices that we make and put out into the world. And I think, given everything going on right now with the pandemic, this is really an opportunity to create a more responsible tech industry, and that we can't just carry on business as usual. This crisis can create the conditions for positive change, where we can create environments that value critical reflection, to think about the whole system, and to create more meaningful and impactful design choices. So thank you for your time. There's a lot of resources that I'd like to recommend. And I've put all of those into a Medium post, which you can find here or also share later on Twitter. Thank you.